All right, so we're live. So welcome to everyone. This is the art of sequencing, and this is our live session. So tonight what we'll be looking at is the biomechanics of asana, and we'll be pulling content from the functional anatomy course and really looking at what's happening in specific yoga poses and how do we utilize krama intelligently so that when we're introducing a posture, number one, every single person in the room gets the energetic benefit, no matter what expression or variation they're doing. So how do we bring that intention to the experience? But then also, as we start to support people in unraveling the tension patterns in their body and introducing new movement patterns, how do we do that in a way that's mindful and intelligent so that they can enter these new poses and experience them in a beautiful way without taking their previous misalignments that they might have and exasperating them? And often what I see in asana is the latter, where we're coming in and we're really excited about these larger postures that are more complex. And in that excitement, we forget that within these complex postures, the joints are doing so many different things, and we lose some of the safety aspects and even cause harm, which we really don't want to see in yoga practice. So what I'll do, I've made some cue cards that I will read from Ish, and I hope that they don't show up backwards for you. Can you just give me a thumbs up and make sure that they're okay? I did these earlier today, and just want to make sure we're okay. So what we'll be going through is, first and foremost, the biomechanics of asana. My intention is to remove as much technical language as possible and just get down to plain, what do you see and how do we respond? So we can lean more into our intuitive side versus the technical linear side. So the first thing that I wanted to chat with you about, and I'm going to need to tip this a little bit. Beautiful. So I want to talk about the biomechanics of asana. And if you've started getting into the functional anatomy course, you will have seen some of these terms. And I think what we'll do is we'll create our own terms. So when I talk about the sagittal plane moves down the center of the body. But what I'd really like you to visualize is a woman standing on her yoga mat with her hips facing the short edge of the mat. And if you asked her to do the running man, it's a silly visual. I find they did a study, and apparently we learn so much faster when it's playful. So that's for your benefit. So visualize a woman doing the running man facing the short edge of her mat. It's that running motion. So it's the front body and the back body are activating. Versus when we talk about the frontal plane, it's a side-to-side movement. And you can think of, I'm a little teapot, you're welcome. And then the transverse plane is just twisting. So anything that involves twisting. And that could be twisting at the waist, but it's also twisting in the limbs. And so when we're talking about the limbs, what you might be more familiar with is when I'm talking about medial rotation, which is where we roll toward the midline, and lateral rotation, which is when we move away from the midline, so to the lateral side of the body. If you're familiar with the term latissimus dorsi, so the lats are on the lateral side of the body, if that helps you remember. And so when we're talking about the transverse plane, it's any type of rotation movement, whether that's at the waist or in the limbs. And the reason this is important is because in a lot of yoga poses, we're not a piece of paper. We're never asking someone just to move left or right. We're often asking for 2 planes of movement, or perhaps even 3 planes of movement to occur all at the same time. And as adult learners, the idea of proprioceptive awareness, of being aware of my body, is actually quite challenging for a lot of people. So most people will be able to hold a few cues. So I say, place your foot here or place your hand there. And then by the time I get to do this with your head, their foot is no longer where we originally decided it should go. And if I give them 5 more cues, they're so lost, it's like a game of Twister. So when we talk about proprioceptive awareness, a lot of us aren't in our bodies, we're in our heads, which is why we're doing yoga, which is great. It gives us all the opportunity for a really beautiful profession. However, when we're teaching students and we're trying to teach them safely, it gives us this powerful opportunity, and we essentially have this double-edged sword. The very same poses that I use that will help you, if they're not done with wisdom, they can hurt you. And so it's fascinating to me. You think of lotus pose, which is where we tangle our legs up into the world's most elaborate pretzel. That, if it's done therapeutically and you utilize krama and you ease into the posture and over time release the correct muscles, that's very healing for your knees. But if I just sat all of you down and said, okay, throw your legs into lotus pose, half the room would have a meniscal tear by the end of the night, I'm pretty sure. I'm just like roughly guessing. And this is because of what's happening in the joints. So if there's only one joint at play, great, awesome. But if there are several joints at play, then the biggest joint is the apex. And if the biggest joint isn't released and it's not ready to do what you're asking it to do, then the smaller joints are going to accommodate you, which could mean snap and ouch. So let me just see if I can fix something here. Beautiful. Okay. So we have our visual, excuse me. So talking about the sagittal plane, we have our woman doing the running man. And this is typically going to be the postures where you're facing the short edge of your mat. And technically, it's when we're inviting either extension or flexion of the front body or the back body. And so we don't even have to use those words if you don't want, but it's that movement of that running, that locomotion. So the movement of forward and backward movement. And if we look at the specific asana families that fall into this sagittal plane of movement, we're looking at our forward bends. So anything forward folding. So the intention of forward folding postures is typically to create space in the spine. So by that I mean create space between each vertebrae. Also to lengthen the superficial back line of myofascia that runs from the bottom of the feet up along the back of the legs, through the back of the spine, the back of the head, and into the forehead. So the superficial back line, it's forward moving postures to create sensation through the spine, to lengthen that tissue. In particular, we're getting into the hamstrings, the erector spinae, and so on. When we look at the back bend family, these are postures that move in the opposite direction of forward folds, and it's about opening the front body. It can be a little more complex. There's a bit more going on the front body than there is the back body. This will affect the deep front line of fascia, which is essentially your core muscles. So that's primarily going to be your adductors, so your thigh muscles, the pelvic floor, the psoas, which creates stability for the whole body, the transverse abdominis, and of course we have the masseter through the jaw. And I'm leaving out quite a few on purpose, but just want to give you that review that back bends are affecting that deep front line. So we're inviting our core muscles into stretch when we go into a back bend. It's also affecting the superficial front line of muscles, which is going to be more the quadriceps. And that's your main muscle that we're going to talk about tonight when we talk about back bends. We're going to talk a lot about psoas and quadriceps. And I've added a subfamily here, which is the Warrior One series. And this is because the Warrior One series are all postures, and we'll go through these in a little more detail in a bit. But the Warrior One series are all postures that sagittal plane movement, you're facing the short edge of the mat, but many of them are actually asking you to draw into a back bend. Warrior One itself is a back bend. It's a very small back bend, but nonetheless, it is a back bend. If you look at what's happening in the spine, we're inviting extension into the lumbar spine. I didn't put on this list stabilizing postures, but some of the majority of the stabilizing postures that we might practice would also fall into this sagittal plane of movement. So child's pose, downward dog, standing forward fold, seated forward fold. All of those postures are stabilizing and they have an effect on either the front or back body. Okay. All right. And within this group, we do have symmetrical and asymmetrical poses. So some of the postures will have the left and right side doing the same thing. Some of the postures are going to be identical on both sides. Some are going to be entirely different on both sides. So Warrior One, my left side will be different from my right side. Okay. Let's look at transverse plane of movement. So again, this is twisting its rotations primarily from a fascial point of view. We get into what's called the spiral line, which is a very, very complex line that we won't go through today. And it does affect the side body a bit as well. So that would be your lateral line of fascia. And unlike the sagittal plane where we have symmetrical and asymmetrical postures, the twisting postures are primarily asymmetrical because the act of twisting is going to have one side of your body doing something different from the other. And we talked about this before, but I'll point it out again. With transverse plane movement, that does include not just rotation at the waist or the neck, but it's also rotation through the limbs. So medial and lateral rotation of either the arms or the legs. Okay. And then we have frontal plane movement. So the frontal plane would be if we were to draw a line that separated the front body from the back body. And the frontal plane is, again, it's that I'm a little teapot movement. It's that side-to-side movement. And for our visual, most of the frontal plane movement postures are going to happen along the long edge of your mat. The primary movements that occur within this are abduction, so that's when we're taking something away from center, or adduction when we're bringing something back towards center. It's this movement through this line. So whether that means I'm bending at the waist or I'm abducting my arm, it's movement in this way. And what primarily falls into this category is the Warrior Two series of asana. And again, we're going through these in great detail. But Warrior Two series would include Warrior Two, triangle, side angle, half moon pose, and so on. Primarily, this affects the lateral line of fascia. And it does include both symmetrical and asymmetrical postures. Eleonora added some of her own notes for you here, as you can see. She thought that was important that you knew that. Okay. Okay. So let me bring this back up for a second. Why is this important? It's important because the joints are important and they don't last forever. And people are trusting us. And yes, Catherine has a great question. I will be photographing these documents and uploading them for you to have. I've learned technology. Okay. But the reason that these things are important is because people are trusting us with their bodies, and there's a very creative element that comes in when we're teaching yoga. And it's important that we always understand that if I have the body moving in one plane of movement, that I need to mindfully come out of that plane before entering another plane. And when I don't do that, what often happens is the joints, which are being asked to either go this way or this way or this way, are going to get compromised and will actually get shearing of the joint, which can damage the bone and cause arthritis, or it can aggravate any inflammatory issue that's already there. So it can exacerbate things. But also it can have an effect on the ligaments that wrap that joint that are there to provide stability. Okay. So whenever we're doing a yoga practice, the first thing we're always looking at, if we have people in more of a vinyasa environment where we are asking for movement, so we want to make sure that the bones are aligned first. So that's always, those of you that are in the more advanced training, you know that that's what I always go to, is look at the bones first. What's the story there? What's happening? And then we want to look at the mobility of the biggest joint that's being impacted. And a really great example of that is pigeon pose. We're going to pick on pigeon pose a lot tonight for good reason. So say I'm in a pigeon pose and my pelvis has some restriction. It could be any type of restriction. It could be the bone is restricted, maybe just anatomically it's the way my pelvis is and I'm not able physically to move or force my bones any further. There could be an injury there. There could even be muscle tension, like I could have an adductor shortening or something that doesn't really allow me to get that full rotation in the front leg. So if my pelvis isn't able to take me into the pose, yet I, as your student, have this idea that in order to do the pose and in order to have this beautiful yoga experience, I have to do it the way that you just did it. That's where we really run into an issue, because what will happen is that in my trying to mimic what I'm seeing you do, just the law of the way things work in the body will come into play. And the smaller joint, which in this case would be my knee, will likely compensate to allow the posture to happen, which means that I'm likely going to be overstretching into the medial collateral ligaments. I could be causing damage to the meniscus that buffers between the tibia and the femur. And it might look like I'm doing the pose, but if I'm feeling that in my knee, then what I'm actually doing is causing harm to my body, and I'm damaging the knee. So when we're looking at these postures, what I think is really important to do is, as you learn a pose, ask yourself how many joints are involved in this posture. And say that you're in a seated staff pose. So you're just seated, your legs are straight out in front of you, and you're just sitting there like an L and you're not doing anything. The only joint that's really affected in that scenario, your arms aren't even up and overhead. The only joint that's really affected is your pelvis. That's the only thing that's happening there. I would consider that a simple pose. But then if we take that same shape and we put ourselves into a downward dog pose. So I'm still in an L shape. All I've done is hinged at my hips, but now my hands and my feet are pressing on the floor. So now my hands, so the joint of the wrist and the joint of the ankle, have come into play. Downward dog, just by pure math, is a more complicated posture than staff pose because there are 3 joints that are impacted. And you could technically count each wrist as 2, and then we'd have to really do addition and things. That's not the point of tonight. But if you think of each time you're doing a pose, how many joints are impacted? When you look at pigeon pose. What's going on there, and how many different things are you asking your body to do? Your right leg is coming back into extension. So that's going to affect the right ilium. It's going to be asking the right ilium to come into more of an anterior tilt. Your left leg, if it's the forward leg, I should have stated that first, is being asked to come into flexion. It's also being asked to come into lateral rotation. And then, depending on where you place the tibia and your foot, you might be asking for there to be a rotation in the forward part of the leg as well. So there's a lot going on. So the more joints involved in a posture, the more complicated the posture is. And the more complicated a posture is, the higher up the krama ladder it should be. And what I mean by that is that a simple pose like staff pose is a pose that you practice to practice something else. It's foundational. Staff pose would be a really great posture to teach people who you want to teach downward dog. It's the same shape as downward dog. It's moving in the same sagittal plane movement. And let me just fix that thing there. That means that Dandasana, so staff pose, is a building block for downward dog. But then you look at something like pigeon pose, and it's complicated. So it's high up on the food chain. So the entire thing that tonight is about is what are the postures that we would sequence prior to pigeon pose to help someone experience that posture. Okay. And another way to look at it too is the more planes of movement that are involved, the higher the complexity of the pose. So if you're asking someone to move in the sagittal plane and the transverse plane and the frontal plane all at the same time, that's high up on the food chain. That's like an apex pose. Okay. All right. So the next sheet, I tried to use lots of colors so that it would make this conversation exciting and interesting for everyone. Okay. I also drew pictures. So what I wanted to look at is the Warrior 2 family. I think I need to tip this just a little bit more. There we go. So when we look at Warrior 2, like I said, I've drawn you some pretty pictures here, and I'm trying to see them myself upside down, which is interesting. So here's our Warrior 2, if you can see this. Let's look at exactly what we're asking someone to do in this posture. So in our forward leg, we're asking them to invite a lateral rotation. So I've drawn the arrow for you. So in this forward leg, we're asking them to invite this lateral rotation of the thigh. And then we're also asking them to invite a medial rotation of the shin. So sometimes this cue is shins in, thighs out. That's what that cue means if you've ever heard it in an Anusara class. And then in the back leg, we're asking people to invite a medial thigh rotation. So we have some transverse plane movement going on. We're facing the long edge of the mat, so we are moving in the frontal plane through the legs. And we could technically even say that there's some sagittal plane movement when we talk about the loops and alignment that we're wanting to invite through the pelvic loop, the kidney loop, and the shoulders. So we're wanting to puff into the kidneys to create space between the ribs and the pelvis. There's a sense of lengthening through the cervical spine. Okay. What else did I want to point out for you here? I can't see this. Give me 1 second. Right, and then also when we look at the back foot, we have that 45-degree angle, and I wrote ish because what's really important is that we're asking students to find the place that feels most supportive for their own pelvis. So if we look at this posture, the primary intention of this pose is to move within the frontal plane. So what's happening with the legs is a frontal plane movement. And then the secondary intention is that transverse plane movement because of the rotations that we're doing through the thighs. And then if we look at the other postures in this family, and I apologize, I would have taped this up on the wall like I normally do, but there was an incident with the tape. Just gonna leave it at that. So here's triangle pose. So triangle pose is also in this same family of movement. The feet are in a fairly similar orientation. And if we look at triangle pose, we have the frontal plane movement and also the transverse plane movement through the thighs as we find orientation for the knee and so on. And let me see if I can change how I'm standing here so that I can just do this. Okay. So if we look at triangle pose, it becomes a little more complex than warrior two. So if we were going to make a krama food chain, triangle pose would be a little bit higher than warrior two because it's more complex. The legs are fairly similar. We started to straighten that forward knee. But now what we're adding is a transverse rotation of the rib cage. And so this is something to keep in mind as you're preparing someone to enter into this pose, is what are postures that you can do earlier on in the practice that would help them become familiar with that transverse rotation of the ribs? Are there any twists that you could do while on the floor or seated that would help them learn how to activate those oblique muscles? And then higher up the food chain still, we would have side angle pose. Side angle pose is quite similar to triangle, but now what we're doing is we're asking someone to have even stronger oblique engagement as they start to lean their body even lower. So their torso is lowering closer to the ground. Their knee is bent now, of course, but it's that same oblique engagement, but now it's even more intensified. And so this would be krama within asana. We see this flow a lot, move from warrior two into triangle pose and then side angle pose. But then we could spend some time even just talking about the krama of side angle pose, because there's obviously many, many progressions of side angle pose. And so what I'll just say right now is if I am doing a sequence and side angle pose is my peak pose, I would likely have done work with some of these postures first to prepare my students. But then as I introduce krama within the pose, as I introduce how to expand more deeply into this posture, what I'm going to start discussing and looking for is that oblique engagement solid enough that the pelvis is still stable while I'm inviting this deep rotation through the waist? And is that stable on its own before I add any other variations, like bringing my hand closer to a block and then growing that toward the floor, or even adding the bind? What we'd want to be careful of is that we would never add the bind of the arms unless we had seen that that core stability was first established and that the pelvis was stable. And it's that same thing we were talking about with pigeon pose, in that if we're not stable in the pelvis, we could take and create injury into the shoulders. And I've actually seen that where, and I don't know if I might do better just to show you visually. So I've actually seen that where someone goes and they bring the bind and they wrap their arm. And what I've actually seen is getting damage into the pec minor tissues, because the person is trying to force the bind and they're really struggling to get their leg. And then once they're anchored to their leg, the teacher asks them to spin through the rib cage. Well, my arm is just about as far down as I can possibly go. So now when I do this, if you can see my arm, now when I do this movement of rotating, I pull and I cause strain here. Can you see that? Yeah. Whereas if I'm established, my pelvis is solid, and I've done the core work and I'm already there, and then it's just an energetic, oh, I can just easily clasp, then great, why not? Do you know what I mean? Okay. And we are going to take a break and actually have some conversation time. I just wanted to get through this little part first. It's like show and tell. Okay, and then even more complex still would be half moon pose. And technically, maybe half moon pose and side angle pose would be, predators of a same nature. They kind of travel together. Maybe one isn't more advanced than the other. But you can see where with all of these postures, it's important that we're establishing the baseline first. And that doesn't mean that when you're teaching that you have to tell every single student, every single time, every single step. I think what it asks of us is that we develop more of a relationship with our students and really start to look and see what we're seeing. And so if I have everyone in a Warrior 2 and I'm not seeing any fires and I'm not seeing any issues, why would I spend 5 minutes yammering about Warrior 2 and alignment in it? If I see that the mobility in the pelvis is there and things are looking fluid for the majority, then we can move on. I would never want you to think that I'm saying you have to have this rigid spiel that you say all the time. I'm hoping that what comes across is the opposite. We have to really start looking at the people that are in front of us and being curious and getting out of our comfort zone and saying, I'm seeing this. This is what I think is happening. What do you think? And then I think too, inviting them into the conversation and empowering them to say, that doesn't feel safe in my body. I don't want to do this pose. I'm not going to. And have them not feel like that's a bad thing to be able to say that to you. So a few trauma-related questions that I wanted to chat about around this is, first off, what is happening in the posture? So before you teach a pose, any pose, what's happening? And so just quickly, if everyone can just think of a random posture, write it down. I'll give you a minute and I won't talk, but I promise. But ask yourself what's happening in the pose. So I'll give you a moment. Okay. Stay with that pose. Stay with me. Is more than one joint affected? What are the joints that are affected in that pose that you're looking at? And if there is more than one joint affected, what is the apex joint? So is there an apex joint and what is it? And if that joint isn't mobile, what would happen to the other joints? Okay, perfect. And this is where I get to play a game and I unmute somebody's microphone randomly. I choose Evelyn.
Okay.
Hello, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm good, nice to see you.
You too.
Do you mind sharing? I should ask.
No, I'll try. It's one that I'm not super familiar with, but I've been asked to teach it as part of the students' curriculum. It was, I don't know if it's the proper frame, cow's face.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome, I hate that pose, that's perfect.
I know. I'm not very big fan of it either, but I've been asked to teach it. So, yeah. So what do you want to ask me? You want me to say the joints affected first or?
Well, tell me, just like, let go of any complicated language and just what do you see happening in the pose?
Oh. Okay, so, I mean, it's obviously the elbows, the shoulders, the wrists, the hips, the knees is kind of everything. And I was like, I'm dreading having to teach it with high school kids. But yeah, it's a lot of wrists. There's a lot of tightness, especially for students that I see in the shoulders. So, and then they want me to combine that with the legs. I just feel like I probably would have to separate them and just focus on one and then do another one another day. I just don't see that happening right away. Just because there's so much rotation and difficulty with kids even being able to reach. So I'd probably use the strap and stuff like that to kind of lower it so it's not as intense for people and something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
If the elbow joint or the shoulder joints are really struggling, it would definitely put some of the other ones at risk, I would think, or I don't know, definitely if the hips weren't flexible enough or if I hadn't done any warm up for the hips, then the knees, I think, would be in jeopardy, if that's what we're looking for.
Yeah. No, it's you know, this is perfect. I think that's a really great pose to look at because it is so complicated. If you look at, if these were the legs, we're essentially asking each leg to do this.
Yeah, on top.
So on top of one another. And so there's what's happening just in the legs. So we're asking for that extreme lateral rotation of the femur, right? I look like a chicken now. But then also we're asking for that transverse plane movement through here. We're abducting. Yeah, we're abducting and adding at the same time. Yeah, because you have to take it away and then plunk it back in a new spot. So it's about as complex as it gets, and then you add it into the shoulders as well. So what I'd love to do is grab my paper, and I want to just use this time to draw it out together as a group and just break it down and just apply this so that it's not just me yammering all night and talking about what you should and shouldn't do. Like, let's actually do it together. And give me a second because I'm going to just see if I have an option that doesn't involve using tape. I don't. Okay, that's all right. We'll make it work. We'll make it work. So first off, why don't we can move this over. Okay. Everyone can see me here, yes? Okay. So the pose that Evelyn's talking about is Gomukhasana. Or cow-faced pose. And if we were to look at the posture from the back, so this is someone's spine here, the right leg is going to come forward like so, and then the left leg would come forward over it like that. And that looks like two mountains with a pole in the center, but we'll just work with it. And then essentially what's happening with the arms is similar. We have one arm that's coming up and then reaching back behind. There's our fingers. And then the other arm is coming from down and behind and reaching up to clasp the other hand. Can you see that okay? I think I'm a little far away. So something like that, except the knees would be stacked one over the other, of course. So we can have two different conversations here. We can talk about what's happening in the bones, but then we can also talk about what's happening in the ligaments. I'd like to talk about the ligaments first. Because essentially what's happening is I'm bringing that leg into flexion. Then I am asking it to laterally rotate. So I'm moving in that transverse plane. And then I'm taking the leg across and back, and I'm bringing my foot past where my pelvis is. So I don't know if you can kind of see me. I should lower that down just a touch. Right? So we have flexion, lateral rotation, and then the leg is coming all the way in. And then we tuck it back behind. I can't float in the air. I haven't evolved to that level of yoga yet. So just imagine that my other leg is stacked underneath in that exact opposite orientation. So when we have lateral rotation of the leg, what's essentially happening at that SI joint is the femur head is pushing into the ilium, and it's pushing the ilium closer to the sacrum. So if we think about what's happening in the sacrum when we sit in that position, the ilium is pushing into the sacrum. So we could say that that SI joint is closed. So from a ligament stability point of view, I'm not as worried. Whereas I think some of you must work with children or you know about this. Often care providers say that it's really dangerous for children to sit in a W sit. Have you heard this before? Do you know this term?
Oh,
The reason, have you heard this?
yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the reason we never want children to sit in W sit is it's the exact opposite orientation. It's bringing the legs into extreme medial rotation, which is damaging on the knee, but it also creates too much space in that SI joint, and then we're stretching those pelvic ligaments. Okay, then if we talk about what's happening muscularly to get into the pose, and I think this is where sequencing actually can be really fun. And we've got our little diagram here. Why don't we bring, actually, I'm gonna bring this over. So we can, this will work better. So let's think about it from the floor up. What's the very first thing that we should do to help our students prepare for experiencing this pose? And we could focus on the arms, we could focus on the legs, doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
What would be the most helpful thing that we could do muscle-wise? So I'll give a hint for the legs. In order for my legs to be able to come into Gomukhasana, I need to be able to do that lateral rotation. So,
like bound angle?
Yeah, so exactly. So if I'm wanting to come into Gomukhasana, this is the orientation. So here's half. What needs to be opened up first? What comes to mind for me is, in order to experience lateral rotation, I need to be freed up in my adductors.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, any pose that's going to open the adductors and allow for that abduction. And I think this is why I wanted to talk about the biomechanics more tonight, is if you can learn the biomechanics, just the basics, and say what's happening in the pose. Well, we know in Gomukhasana, I'm asking the leg to abduct, and laterally rotate. And I know that if I'm abducting the leg, then that means that the adductors, which help me bring and move in the opposite direction, have to be released.
Mm-hmm.
So any posture that's going to help me release that. And so why don't we, and what I'll do is I'll unmute. This is going to be chaos. I'm going to unmute everyone for a moment.
Ew.
Woohoo! We're wild and crazy now. So open forum. Let's throw out some poses that would target the adductors to release tension in the adductors.
I don't know what it's called, Seth, but like like this.
I can't see you. Hold on. It's Sarah who's talking, right?
Yeah, it was Sarah.
Oh man, I'm good. Okay, hold on.
You are good. There's like 20-some people in here.
It's a gift. I cannot find you though for the life of me. Oh, here you are. Oh, your video's not on though.
It's not on?
No. So
yes,
I found your.
I
can see her.
You can?
Yep.
It says it's on.
Mine has no video of you. That's
Sarah, keep talking and you'll show up.
There you are. Yeah.
Now?
so everyone can see her except for me. It seems a little unfair.
She's in between E. Clark and Magdalena.
There she is.
Oh
Yeah.
wait, hold on.
Oh.
Okay.
Nowhere.
I can't find you at all for the life of me. This is too funny. This is why I mute you all for the longest time, because I get flustered when technology takes over.
Nope.
I don't know.
I can't see you. Okay, here, open forum. If anyone can tell me what you see Sarah doing, and I'll, okay.
Kind of like
She was folding one leg on top of the other.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's like, this is going to be a game of charades, isn't it? Oh, wait, I see her. She's up now. Okay, hello. Okay, yes. Okay, good. This is hilarious.
Oh gosh.
Okay, so you're coming into more of like a twist.
Yeah, but like just
Okay.
to kind of get like the legs, you know.
Absolutely. Very similar. So I will draw that. I'm going to attempt to draw that. So I would say that is pretty close to the other posture though still. I'm not drawing that. That's not working out very well. I give up. Okay, so let's just talk about it.
Could
So
you just?
well, everyone can see me, yes?
Yes.
Okay, so I would say that this would be the pose that I would put right before we went into Gomukhasana.
Could you straighten the leg that's on top and just forward fold onto one extended leg before we get into that?
Yeah, like this?
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And I would say that this would fall right before that one. So we have yes. Oh, wait, no, this is good. So we have our krama established. We know that the high 3 pecking order now.
What about like the thread and the needle one that you kind of did to kind of get the outside of the legs, like
Okay.
in your back?
So now we're getting more accessible. Yep, absolutely.
And
And
even
then maybe
hugging the knee. Sorry.
yeah, no, that's. And then hugging the knee and extending the other leg long.
Mm-hmm.
There we go, like so.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect, good. Okay, we can get even more accessible.
Even more, just both legs
Maybe
down,
sit up.
grabbing one leg, like both legs down, and then just hugging one knee before that. So kind of.
Or could you just sit up from that point?
I can. Okay, here, I'll sit up for a moment.
Like do it from a seated position instead of from a laying down position?
Yeah, absolutely. But what about, so we've done a lot with the leg coming over.
Yeah.
And that's great because that's getting into all those external rotators, which is definitely a factor for that pose. But what if we just take that out of the equation and bring the foot to the floor and start focusing on the adductors? So what would be even lower on the pecking order than what we've just done?
What about staff pose?
Okay, I heard staff pose. I think for this particular pose, because we're focusing more on a frontal plane movement, so abducting and adduction, staff pose is more of a sagittal plane movement. So I don't think I would lean into that one right now. And then the other pose I heard was Sukhasana. Is that, someone said easy pose?
Yeah, the boat caterpillar pose.
Yes. I think caterpillar is still going to be more sagittal plane movement. Correct me if I'm wrong. So I liked this direction. We're opening the adductors. What else could we do that would highlight that opening?
A wide-legged forward fold.
Okay, perfect, good. So wide leg forward fold. What if I wanted to highlight the adductors of just one leg as opposed to both legs?
Straighten one leg out and have one in.
Yeah. Okay, so then I could bring.
Move, I forget what it's called.
Yeah, so like a half bound angle.
Yeah.
So a half bound angle. So I'm kind of in a wide leg stance. I set myself up for half of a bound angle and come down to focus on the adductors of that front leg. Okay. We could also look at the full bound angle. Okay, what else?
What if you're lying on the ground and then you kind of bring, you have your feet against the wall and then you kind of bring your hip down. I don't know if I can really show this. This will be interesting. Kind of like that against the wall, and you got the adductor of one leg. Can you see it? I don't know if that's
No. I have to keep clicking until you're all on the top of my screen, and so it's like a really cruel game for me.
I don't even know.
I can't find you. Yeah. I think it was helpful if you talk me through it and then I just try to do it. Although it is entertaining, I feel like I'm playing charades in the reverse. Here, why don't we bring the drawing board back up for a second?
What about legs against the wall?
Legs against the wall. So like Viparita Karani, like
Yes.
legs up the wall?
Yes.
Okay. I would think of that as still being more of a sagittal plane movement, and we're wanting to look for more frontal plane movement. So let's draw some things. I'm going to attempt to do this. Let's see.
What about warrior two?
Warrior pose. Yeah, absolutely. Warrior two. Yep. So, okay, yeah, here, if you're talking, I'll just draw. You tell me what to draw, but I'll put.
I was trying to explain that. I guess it would have been the warrior two on the ground, like lying on the ground with your feet against the wall.
Supta Virabhadrasana 2. So, yeah, absolutely. So let's just draw a wall here. And now we have this person lying down in Warrior 2. We could even place a sandbag over their ankle ankles, and thigh. So any yoga posture that you do, you can really turn into a restorative posture. You just take it to the floor and add some creativity. But I think the most important thing to look at is what's happening in the legs. And what's happening in the legs in this pose is we're asking for the legs to abduct, so to draw away from the center, and to laterally rotate. And so basically what we want to look at is all of the postures that ask the legs to abduct and laterally rotate. So what I would do, and I think this is a great homework practice, hint, hint, is to go through your manuals, look on the internet as well, and look for postures that are going to do that orientation. And so I'll just draw some out for us right now. So if we look at bound angle pose, here's our person. Okay, so there's our bound angle pose. In bound angle pose, we have that same orientation, right? So the legs are taken from the center line. We're laterally rotating. We could do a half of a bound angle pose. So all that means is I'm doing the same bound angle posture, but I've kicked one leg out to the side, so it's out of the equation. And what I'll do is I'll draw these and then I'll physically show them afterwards so we can make the connection. We could do a wide leg seated fold. All of those postures are going to be inviting that same movement. The Baddha Konasana more so. Okay. And then the other factor that we started to talk about is that with that movement of the hips, it is really getting deeply into your external rotators. And so what I would look at is more the double fire log series, Evelyn. So I think, oh, there's Evelyn, I can still see you. So I'm going to remute everyone just for a moment. There we go. And then I'm going to unmute Evelyn again. There we go. Okay. So Evelyn, what I would really look at is a series of postures that you do with your students over time that's first off going to focus, like I was saying, on releasing those adductors and inviting that action where we're taking the legs apart, we're getting into the adductors. So whether that is a bound angle pose, or a half bound angle pose, or a wide-legged forward fold. I feel like the bound angles are a little more targeting what we want to get into. But then the other factor that I would look at quite a bit is that to bring this leg all the way over, what I'm feeling is into those external rotators. All this feels tense. And so what I would look at is getting into the double fire log series, where if you look at my leg, I'm in that exact same rotation again. I've taken my leg, I've abducted my leg from the center line, and I'm laterally rotating the thigh. And this is really what the biomechanics of asana and using krama is all about, is finding those key actions and then mimicking them in more accessible ways. So what I've come into here is a deer pose or a Z pose, so a yin posture that's going to get into those rotators. I'm inviting an anterior tilt to my pelvis and I'm coming down. And I would say this is going to be one of your key poses for your students to practice to come into that.
Okay.
Where this eventually grows is Agni Stambhasana or double fire log, and that's where we're stacking the legs and we're doing that same action, one leg on top of the other. And you can see how this is a really lovely precursor for cow face. Can you see that?
Yeah, yeah, because you just have to bring the knees, eventually you can bring them a little bit closer and closer, right?
Exactly. And so what I would say is if we're looking at that krama system of what's the most complex, this would probably be your peak pose for your students for quite some time. And then you would notice that some of your students are going to have more pelvic mobility than others. And so then the way that you would introduce cow face is that for those students, you know, if you're in this pose and you're not really feeling any sensation and you'd like to experiment with taking the posture into a deeper experience or what have you, you know, use accessible language, then you would invite them to learn to start playing with growing it, right? And so what happens eventually is that double fire log starts to grow, and you can see how that's becoming, yes?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's what, and then all of the other suggestions that the gals had given about, you know, being here, being here, you can kind of see those tiers of how you could work them in into the session and what's going to be the precursor to that. But what I suggest for everyone is, as we go through the poses tonight and then as you go through your homework later, is pick a pose, and this is just such a good practice, pick a pose, look at what's happening in that pose, and then how do I mimic that in more gentle and accessible ways. And it goes right back to what I was saying at the beginning, that a lot of the time you're going to have students who won't ever be able to do the peak pose. And sometimes that student is you. I have postures that I definitely cannot do and will never do. So how do we give that gift of the experience of the posture to someone without taking away their joy of the experience? I think we kind of deflate people when we demo this more elaborate, complicated thing, and then the point is lost. It's about people connecting with their heart and feeling good about themselves and feeling this ease in their body that isn't usually there. Yeah. Any questions about that specifically? I'm going to unmute everyone for a second. Evelyn, I'll start with you. Did you have anything?
No, that makes sense for the legs. I like that actually. That makes it a little bit easier to kind of wrap my head around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I would say that'd be a really good homework assignment for you, is to take that pose and sequence it and then submit it, and you and I can play with it more together.
Perfect. I started to make a sequence, but now that I'm thinking a little bit more, there's a lot more that I didn't even think about with that lateral rotation. So,
yeah. And I just want to point out too, Sarah did mention fire log, bingo. And Crystal, supine big toe pose, absolutely, that's brilliant. Supine big toe pose would be another way that we can gently get into those external rotators, especially if we're doing that variation where we're having someone in the pose and then we bring the legs slightly across and up. That can get into those external rotators in a really gentle way. And I would say that would probably be one of your very beginning poses. So is that making sense for everyone? It's about, think of what's happening in the pose and then how to highlight those little areas. And you don't have to mimic the entire pose, but just what's happening in that one joint or one area that you want to focus on. All right, so I have it unmuted for a short time only. Is there anything anyone wants to add?
All the dogs can communicate.
All right, I'm muting you all again. Okay. Okay. Let me get my notes here. Okay. And so I had drawn out a few postures here. And these are all poses that would help facilitate opening into these warrior two postures. And so half frog, where you're laying on your abdomen and you only have one leg out to the side, gets really deeply into the adductors. A wide leg child's pose can get into the adductors. You know, for some people that might not feel very extreme, but if you have someone who's newer to yoga, that could be a pretty intense stretch for them. And I think that's important too, is not just to think of the asana in terms of how it feels in your own body, but how it might feel for a wide variety of people. And big toe pose as well. Okay. So the next thing I want to look at, sorry, it's a little shiny, isn't it? Okay, is the backbending series. So this is more of a sagittal plane of movement. I tried to choose one from each category. So we've looked at the warrior two, and now we'll look at things that fall into warrior one. Let's see if I can do this in a way that's, okay, that works. I think let's tip this. Good. So the absolute apex backbend pose is Raja Kapotasana. I don't know if you can tell what this stick figure is doing, but essentially this person has come into a full wheel pose. They have bent their knees and dropped down onto their shins, and then they have bent their elbows and dropped down onto their forearms. And no, I'm not demonstrating this ever. Okay. So this is Raja Kapotasana. This would be our apex backbend posture. Prior to it, the second most intense is wheel pose. And then what I wanted to look at is, again, just creating that tier of what leads into what. And another thing that I'll just add right now, because we won't get into it this evening, is just understanding how certain postures also prepare us for other postures that are of different orientations. And an example of this is by practicing wheel pose and strengthening the back muscles that come into play when you do this posture. This pose, more than any other, is actually what prepares us for doing handstand. So sometimes the krama that you use will utilize poses from one group to facilitate you learning a very challenging posture from another group. I hope that makes sense. So we have the true king pigeon pose here. So I don't know if you knew this, but this is actually what pigeon pose looks like. We'll get into that shortly. We have a whole separate sheet on this. And then the next stage down would be wheel pose. The next stage down would be bow pose. This is where we're laying on our belly and we reach back and clasp our ankles. The next stage down from that technically would be camel pose, which is bow pose, but we're kneeling on our knees. The next step down from that would be upward dog. So we're in a nice back bend on our tummy, pressing firmly into the hands, arms are straight. Sphinx pose, which is the same posture, but now we're coming down onto our elbows. And then locust pose, the arms have been removed from the mat and now I'm reaching the arms back, and so I'm engaging the back. So if we were to look at krama within back bends, here we are from most intense to least intense. I've also thrown in some postures here along the side, a high lunge and warrior one, and the pigeon pose that we typically practice in yoga class. All three of these fall into the backbend family as well, although they are asymmetrical backbends. The majority of backbend postures are symmetrical, but these would be our asymmetrical backbends. And so just realizing when when we sequence Warrior 1 into a practice, it is a back bend, and that means that it's stimulating to the nervous system. So these three versions of back bends would be non-typical, but I would use them quite a bit from a trauma perspective to prepare me for going into deeper back bends. And what I wanted to talk about is why. So when we bring someone into a deep back bend, first off, we're bringing that low back into extension. We're also bringing the hips into extension. And then we're asking the shoulders to go into flexion. And I drew a little line here for that one because the shoulders are only being involved in that movement within a few of these postures. Obviously, when we have someone in bow pose or upward dog, the shoulders are not going into that orientation. We also have space that we are hopefully facilitating in the vertebrae, so we're not crunching everything together. We are also focusing on the lower body. So there's a lot going on here. We need to release the quadriceps, and we also need to release the psoas. And so just a little note, I try to bring this up every time we talk about quads and psoas. Typically, when your leg that you're working on is bent, so the knee is bent, you're going to isolate the quadriceps and you'll be stretching the quads. So that's part of the superficial front line of fascia. When that same leg is straight, say you're in a lunge and now you straighten that back leg, now you're going to get into the psoas. And so we need to facilitate a bit of openness in both of those muscle groups to get into these deeper back bends. And then also, if we look at what's happening more fine-tuned into the shoulder region, we need to release the pectorals along the front of the chest, some of the deltoid tissue as well, and even into the latissimus through the side of the body, and even the abdominals if you think of the front body there. And then I broke up the prep work into two categories for you. There's a few different things that we might focus on to prepare for back bends. We might focus on restorative postures and prop work. And so the prop work would be for releasing the spine and creating space. So some of the things that we might use are rolled blankets. So we've talked a bit before about Babbling Brook. That's where we have the horizontal placed blankets, and we place one folded just underneath the scapula and one above the scapula, and then we drop the back down and just rest in that posture for a while. So that would be the use of a horizontal bolster. We can place horizontal bolsters anywhere along the spine and just lay on them in a restorative capacity. That creates space between the vertebrae. We can also do vertical bolstering along the length of the spine. And then we can do the placement of blocks along the spine, and so opening up, and we can do unique things with the arms to create space and start to help and open into the shoulder region. And then if you do all of that and you want to go a little bit deeper, there's even more Iyengar-based prop equipments that are wooden that we can lay over. I have some of them at the studio, and I know Melanie has one as well that you can play with and try. So that's the restorative prop work for the spine. And then we also have yin and myofascial release, where we look at those different muscle groups and we start targeting things. So some of the postures that I've drawn for you is the prone clock, where we lay down on the abdomen with one arm out to the side, and then we essentially come into a twist and start to target the myofascial tissue through the pectorals and the abdomen, and even the front of the thigh. There's also shoulder release work where we place our elbows on yoga blocks and then just allow ourselves to rest with the head falling through. Quad release. So we can do quad release either from being in a low lunge and reaching back to clasp our foot, or we can come against the wall and press our foot into the wall and come into a really intense quadricep stretch that way. And I've drawn you a nice little diagram there. Anything from the dragon series within yin yoga, so all the lunges that we can do, big toe pose. And then of course, Vajrasana variations. And so that's where we're getting into the front of the leg. And so we might do a double Vajrasana where we're coming back, or we might do a single where we're just highlighting the front of the leg. Okay. So I'm going to unmute everyone again. Beautiful. Okay, give me a moment. I'm just going to read some of these questions. Beautiful. Okay. So Cheryl's asking, what about pelvic considerations when doing back bends? Cheryl, I'm going to unmute you here, and then can I ask you just to lean into that a bit more with me? Is that okay? Okay. I'm trying to ask permission. Yeah. Oh.
I was just thinking, is there any pros or cons for doing back bends pelvically related?
I think, sure. I think what I would look at is what's happening in the legs. So for myself, having scoliosis, I have my right leg is functionally shorter than my left, and my left leg, because of that, is always trying to just get by. And so it laterally rotates often. And so what I've found is, because of that lateral rotation of the leg, that does affect my pelvis. And therefore, when I'm coming into a back bend pose, it can be a little more tricky for me. So I have to do a lot more like traction work with my legs to create space at the acetabulum, if that makes sense. And then I often, before doing any back bend work, would do like a seated staff pose, where I'm focusing on that medial rotation of the thigh, and I'm really working on getting that alignment before I do the back bend work. And I obviously am doing a lot of work to try to get that shortening evened out so that I'm on an even surface. Trying to think of other instances. Nothing's coming to mind at the moment. Did you have any specific things you were
kind of thinking of? Yeah, just pelvis in general. I know we'd have to stretch the deep front line and all that stuff, but I just thought if there was any pelvic considerations.
Yeah. I mean, if I was super pregnant and I was having pubic symphysis pain, I wouldn't be going into a deep back bend. I can't imagine a woman that's that pregnant wanting to do that. This feels like a good idea. Yeah, I'll definitely.
That's good. Didn't know if there's anything specific that.
Yeah.
Look at, but that answers it.
Yeah, I'll think about it, and if I think of anything else, but I think it has a lot to do with the legs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if someone does, like even someone who's postpartum, I might be cautious and make sure, because of relax and being in the system, so there could be some pelvic instability. But because the back bends are primarily symmetrical, they're actually postures that I use to invite stability into the pelvis. So I'm not as concerned just for that reason alone.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, oh, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions before I choose my next subject? I do enjoy that part. Can you tell? It's like, ooh, who am I gonna pick on? I don't really see it that way, but it feels a little bit like that. Wonderful. Jen Harrison, hello. I'm gonna unmute. Hello, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
I'm good.
I don't know if you can see me, but can you hear me?
I can see you. I love your pink shirt.
Oh, thank you. All right. Any questions? Not particularly. I had a question from not last class, but the class before, just in that vinyasa series about clarifying one of the poses.
Yes.
But other than that, it's going okay so far.
Okay. I wrote a note down. Thank you for bringing that up.
I did see that.
Okay. Yeah, so basically the poses that you were asking about, I think we just did.
Yeah.
Because it was basically the bound angle pose and taking it with one leg out to the side. So it's a half bound angle.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I guess my question with that, so when you have it in the half bound angle, the orientation of the hips.
Mm-hmm.
So if a student, if their sit bones aren't making contact with the floor,
Mm-hmm.
so when you prop them, will the orientation of the hips still go forward, or is it going to go like a little bit to the side? Like it's like, I guess
Mm-hmm.
another way to look at it, like when you're in like deer or Z pose, like it's
Mm-hmm.
almost on like a 45. So just
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking, I guess, for some like language on how to specifically do that.
Mm-hmm. So the student that you're propping, was it because that they're in a more of a posterior pelvic tilt and you propped them to have, okay.
Yeah, and in that posterior tilt, like there's like a quite significant difference between the left and the right in terms of the space between their sit bones and the floor. So I don't know if that's just like an anatomical thing, but that was one thing that I noticed. It was posterior, but there was one side where it was like a glaring difference, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So a few thoughts on that. If there's a way to gently nudge them or their parents that's within school board regulations to see a chiropractor, I'd suggest having that looked at.
Yeah,
because
it was really like, yeah, it was just very like disproportionate.
Yeah, like typically children are going to be more aligned than us adults. I know for myself, having scoliosis, that's a big red flag that you would see in my body, is when you draw me into something like this and I go forward, you're going to go, oh, because you're going to see the different heights within my pelvis.
Okay.
And so hearing that that's in a child's body, if it's possible to, I don't know what the regulations are.
And I think that that's just a, hey, I've noticed it's
yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
And then the other thing is just going back to simple teaching rules, if we call them that. If you see one side of the body is more limited than the other, then our job is to make the side that's more mobile match the side that's less mobile. So
I guess bringing it right back and just, I guess, even in just like an easy pose, getting them used to that propping, or like,
So if you're seeing something in their body that's already severely asymmetrical, then probably not taking them in that deep, like backing it up quite a bit until you find a way to bring symmetry into the posture for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then I guess it would just be cueing for that person around like inviting that breath into wherever they're at, and just using that breath to like find symmetry in that place where they're still able to access, and the point being that they're linking that breath with the movement, and that's okay if that's all that they're able to do.
Yeah.
No, that clarifies it. But breaking down in that double fire log series, that kind of like helped me sort of like if I was to create a sequence, that there's the steps right there. So I think that got to the bulk of my questions.
Sweet. Thank you so much. Wonderful. What was your pose that you were thinking about earlier?
I picked a wide-legged child's pose, actually. So,
okay.
So for joints, and I'm thinking of this more like in an active way. So shoulders, wide leg, your hips, even like your wrists, like really walking through that activation through the arms. And ankle joints. I mean that can put some strain. And yeah, that was the one that that I sort of was thinking of as we were going through one that went forward. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think even it makes me really sad that there's so many people that feel like, you know, that they can't do yoga. You know, it's so common, it'll come up, you know, for me, I'll be out in professional whatever or not professional settings, and my profession, like what I do for a living, comes up, and so often I have people say to me like, oh, I could never do yoga, I'm not flexible enough, I'm da 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 da, my body doesn't blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Insert horrible things that our society has told us. And I think what makes the best yoga teachers is what I'm wanting to see is even taking something as simple as a child's pose, and how would you make that accessible for someone who hasn't been given the gift to be in their body? Like, how would you even take that posture and apply it on a chair or have them experience it on their back? What if you have someone who has arthritis in their knees and they can't have their knees on the floor? How would they still get that experience of lengthening their spine? And what can you do to support them? And I think just applying that to every single posture. And I do apologize a bit because I wrote a bit of a rant earlier today on the website about that. But I really, yeah, I think for us as yoga teachers, we have this idea that we're supposed to prove to our students, like, I'm a yoga teacher, I really should be up here, so I'm going to show you this really complicated pose now because I need you to know that, like, I'm qualified. When really what we should be doing is the opposite, and looking at our students and we're seeing in their bodies and then mimicking their bodies and then trying to bring the poses to them and saying like, okay, well, you know, just this tiny movement and maybe just a little bit here. I think, anyway, I think we have it a bit backwards. So I'm hoping that us fleshing this out helps to change that in a few people's lives. So, yeah. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna mute everyone again. And beautiful. Let's see. I think some of you are on to me and you've muted your video camera so that I don't choose you. I'm choosing Brienne. I can see you there, 10. Or I'm not supposed to call you Brienne. I'm supposed to call you B. Hello. How
as
are
long
you?
as you don't call me B. As long as you don't call me Bree.
Oh no, I said B. I said it right.
Yeah, I know.
I get points.
You're Brienne. Forget.
Yeah, no problem. Hello, how are you?
I am great. How are you?
I'm good.
Wonderful. I actually chose child's pose as well because last night I taught a class and a guy, his big issue was the ankle portion of child's pose. And I did get I got him to go into it from his back because he could do everything else for child's. But I was thinking, like, what kind of things could we do to work on the mobility of his ankles to increase that so that he would be more comfortable eventually in a traditional child's. So, and I was just thinking, like, you know, like just simple pointing and flexing, like rotation, things like that. But that's all I could think of.
Do you know what was restricting his movement?
He says he's got no ankle problems. I asked him after class and he's just got stiff ankles. I think it's from his job. He does roofing. And
that would do it.
Yeah. So, yeah.
So interestingly, child's pose is the curse and the remedy, because if he's a roofer, yeah, if he's a roofer, then his feet are in hyper dorsiflexion all the time.
Yeah.
And so any pose, yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So for him, any pose that you do.
Comfortable thing that I got him into last night.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So interesting. We can get into that more in the therapy class too. If you bring that up, we can flesh it out a little bit more too.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. Very good.
Yeah, because he said he was coming back next week. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna talk to him about some stuff that can help.
Nice. Very cool. Thanks. Did you want to flesh that out more right now, or do you have any questions?
No.
No. Okay. Cool. All right. Let me.
That was all that was kind of on my mind.
Thank you.
Pick your next victim.
Yes. I feel bad for using that, but it does feel like that's what I'm doing, or like I don't know, I feel kind of Vanna White-ish. Like, yeah. All right, perfect. Thanks so much, B.
Except we're not.
Okay, so I'm just looking through some of their notes. Okay. Beautiful. Okay. Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Okay. So before I choose someone else to chat with, give me a moment here. There we go. I wanted to pick on pigeon pose a little bit. So pigeon pose is a bit of a, what's the word for me? I don't have a word for it. Let's just talk about pigeon pose. We can talk about my own issues later. So I just want to go back to this sheet, and I want to look at Raja Kapotasana. So this is pigeon pose right here. This is king pigeon, Raja Kapotasana, okay? What we are kind of doing in yoga classes typically is Ekapada Raja Kapotasana, so meaning 1 foot king pigeon pose. And so if we're talking about sequencing and krama, king pigeon pose is the apex posture. It's at the top of the food chain there. And then 1 step down from king pigeon pose is 1 foot king pigeon pose. And so this is a posture that's, I would say, pretty intense. There's a lot going on. Pretty much every single plane of movement is happening. So there's a lot of risk to the joints because of that. One of my issues with yoga classes, the way they're taught right now, is that because we've amalgamated the language a bit, we're throwing around terminology from several different schools of yoga intermingled into the same class. And often we don't know what we're referencing. And that's, I don't want to blame anyone, but I do feel that when it comes to more complex postures, we've made a bit of a mess. Because we have teachers using the name of the actual pose. So we're having people say, okay guys, now we're getting into Kapotasana. Well, what we're actually doing when we go into Kapotasana, and we actually go into that version, is nothing like this pose. Are you following me so far? So we've caused confusion for ourselves and our students because, and I'm sorry, it looks like he's in a bit of a low lunge, but his leg is actually forward like a pigeon pose. I can only draw so well. I'm limited here. So So it's caused some confusion about, well, what pose am I going into? And then we have Hatha yoga, we have yin yoga, and in yin yoga it's called sleeping swan or swan. So there's a lot of confusion about what's actually supposed to be happening in the body. Wanted to begin this just by saying, true one-leg king pigeon pose is a back bend. It's essentially the pose that I showed you earlier, if we invert it a bit, where I've come down onto my shins and my forearms and I'm clasping my feet. Except now I've kicked one leg forward into a hip opening posture. And because that leg is kicked forward into a hip opening posture, it provides me with stability, and I can stand onto my legs and be in that pose. So when we're talking about pigeon pose, what we're actually working toward is this pose. Full disclosure, I've never once done that pose where I could touch my feet. It doesn't feel right in my pelvis and my spine, and I think I might break something at this point, having had a baby a little bit ago. So just to share that, you don't have to go into the most elaborate poses to have the most beautiful experience. It's absolutely unnecessary. But what I wanted to talk about is, first off, if you're in a class and you want to incorporate hip openers and you want to have a fun vinyasa practice and you want to incorporate them, my preference would be that you wouldn't include pigeon pose in your classes, just flippantly. And I know that probably every yoga class you've ever taken has had pigeon pose rolled in somewhere, and it's because we all love pigeon pose and it feels so good. However, I do have issue with pigeon pose in particular because it's one of the postures where I was injured. So I have some personal experience with having that knee injury and the recovery that it takes. And once you've injured your knee in that way, it never fully goes away. You'll always have a twinge or two, and you have to be a little more cautious. So because it is a peak pose and because it does ask you to move your body in all three planes of movement, it's complex. If the pelvis isn't ready for the posture and you haven't done all the work with all the poses to really release the pelvis and work up towards this pose, it's very, very likely that you'll put your knee at risk or that you will hurt yourself in your knee. That being said, there's a lot of people who have healthy pelvises and who have mobile pelvises. And they can go into the pose and not have any issues, or they might not have any issues now and they might notice them later. So if you are teaching a class and it's just a fun class and you want to incorporate pigeon in some way, but you haven't done the prep work for it, my humble suggestion would be that you'd offer something from this category instead. So let's say that you're doing a flow, and I know one of the most common transitions is to come into, and actually I know a lot of you did this in your homework. You're not the only one, and I'm most definitely not picking on you. I'm talking about it because a lot of you did do it in your homework. And I just want to honor and say that isn't your fault. You didn't do something wrong. And I know why you did it. I've seen it thousands of times in yoga classes. So you're certainly like following what's been taught to you. I'm not picking on you. But it obviously needs to be chatted about. So what I would suggest is if you're in a flow class and you're wanting to move from downward dog right into a hip opener, instead of asking people to invite that lateral rotation with the leg and come down, just have them slide the leg forward so that the knee and the foot are in alignment with one another. And just ask them to come into an orientation that's straight, so almost like they're in a half child's pose. And what you'll find here is they're going to focus more on the back leg in this scenario, There's still opportunity to bring that back foot up if you wanted to be saucy and do a little more work. But you can flow in and out in this way without putting your knee at risk, because we haven't done anything to release the pelvis. So I'm stacking my joints. I'm just bringing the foot towards my hip, and I'm keeping everything aligned. And that way you can still go through your vinyasa flow. You can still invite those same movements, but it's going to be a little safer. Even if, and then for some people who have knee injuries, even that's going to be a bit much to ask. So if you do have someone with a knee injury, even asking them to come into a child's pose because it's a lot of flexion at the knee isn't going to be accessible. My belief is that probably that person wouldn't come to a huge yoga class, or that they would at least talk to you ahead of time so that you could say, you know, you have a knee injury, please don't do any of the following poses where your foot is getting anywhere near your bum. And then if you are wanting to sequence more hip opening postures within your class, then what I would suggest is sticking within more the yin deer pose variation, where you have the leg forward. And you can do all of this work. This is quite safe. You can incorporate double fire log, which would be the next krama posture after that. And you can even play with starting to experiment with swan pose, but just from this orientation, so that you have your foot towards your groin, and that gives you a little time just to check in and see if your knee is bothering you, if it feels stable, if there's anything funny going on in the pelvis. And then I feel that the safest way to enter into swan pose or sleeping swan pose is actually from this orientation, because it gives me time to check and see how my knee's feeling, and I can actually dial that leg back behind me and come into the pose. Okay, second here. Okay, so if you are going to do a sequence for 1 foot king pigeon pose, likely you would need to do a series of classes over 6 to 8 weeks. And you would need to focus on finding all of the postures. And I bet if you did an internet search and typed in yoga poses that release the adductors, that some lovely soul has created a list somewhere. So just food for thought. But these are all of this is all the work you would need to do to properly come into this pose with safety. You need to do prep work using postures that will help you to release the adductors. So we talked about that a bit earlier tonight. You would need to do postures that help you release the external rotators. You need to do postures that help you release the psoas and the quads. We talked about those as well. You also need to do work to help release the spine, because it is a back bend. You need to do work to release the abdominals. So a lot of the back bending work is going to also support this pose. Work to release the latissimus, the pectorals, and the deltoids. That's assuming that you're wanting to work into the upper body and come into this orientation of the pose where you're reaching back. Okay, so I'm going to unmute. Let's see. Jen Watson, I'm gonna, hello. How are you?
Hi, good, how are you?
Good. What pose did you pick?
I actually picked Z pose.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm talking about it lots.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, what are your reflections on that?
It would be the knees, the ankles, and the pelvis mostly would be involved there.
Yep, absolutely.
And I guess if you move forward, maybe your wrists, if you move forward, stretch that way.
And what, if that was your peak pose, if you were doing Z pose or deer pose, what would be some postures that you might do earlier on just to prepare even for that pose?
Maybe the bound angle pose to stretch the adductors and sorry, my cat's being
That's
weird.
okay. I thought it was one of your boys.
No, well, they're here too, but the cat's just, she won't stop meowing tonight. But I'm not sure. I'll have to think about that for a second. Sorry. My brain's not working super well.
It's okay. Would you like to open up the floor to let other people jump in?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. Sorry to put you on the
No,
spot
that's okay.
there.
I'm just feeling distracted.
All right.
Sorry.
All right. All right. So I'm unmuting anyone. Oh boy. Chaos is about to ensue here. Wow. Okay, I'm gonna remute everyone for a second. I think I got more than I bargained for. The aliens showed up or something. That was really bizarre. Okay, 1 second here. Why don't we do it this way? I'll be silent for a moment, and then if there's anyone who wants to pitch in, maybe you can just type in into the comments, and then I'll unmute you that way. I think that might be a little better. And Evelyn, I'm just reading your note, and you were talking about the deer pose series, like the pigeon pose series. I don't have that written down anywhere precisely. Okay. But I think the video I did last week goes through it pretty thoroughly. And there's also a video that I did just on YouTube for Rachel a few weeks ago that you could look at. It's just on the YouTube channel. Okay, so Kelsey DuPont. Where are you, Kelsey DuPont? There you are. Okay. So Kelsey, I'm just unmuting you here. Can you elaborate? Do you mind? Oh.
Yeah, no,
There you go.
can you hear me?
I can. Hello.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just thought maybe being able to open up the chest and having like, yeah, just that's what I was thinking with Shavasana is more of a like opening and just widening so that when you're in it, finally, it's like a relaxation or something. That's, I don't know, it's more of an intuitive feeling for me. It's like, how do you expand and stretch it beforehand so that when you're in it, it's like a restoration type of a space. That's why I went with the fish.
Beautiful. No, that's beautiful because you're creating space in the spine.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's Googling quickly. What is it called? What is it called? So I did it. I found it.
I still have to use Google sometimes. There's so many words out there. Good grief. Or sometimes when you else turn your homework in, you use words that are new that weren't around. No joke. When I started,
no doubt. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I'm like, what is this? What? I've never heard of this word before. I look it up and I'm like, oh, is this okay?
Right.
It's just a new name
Same
now.
one.
Okay. Same post.
The other thought I had was the locust pose, like opposite.
Yes.
Like flip it maybe as well. Kind of same thing, but more with fire in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And really good for inviting stability to the spine. So both of those poses would be integral to spinal health and mobility.
Perfect.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, let's see here. Beautiful. I'm gonna try the unmute again and just see.
Oh, there we go.
No, that does not work. That's too much. Okay. I'm just gonna stop trying that, although it is entertaining. Okay. All right. Does anyone else have any questions before we wrap up? Believe it or not, our 2 hours have flown right by. You should be able to type it in, or you could unmute yourself. There we go. Perfect. Hello, Sarah.
Hey.
Hi.
Okay, so I have a question. I know that you don't like pigeon
Mhm.
taught in a class, just because obviously it can harm people. But because people don't really do pigeon, I feel like a lot of times in a class setting, they do like this sleeping swan, right? Because they turn it into a forward fold instead of a back bend.
Mm.
So is that why it can cause more damage per se? Is because a lot of people are trying to do the pigeon, but instead of doing it as a back bend, they're doing it as a forward fold?
That could be part of it. I think a lot of people have desk jobs and they only get to come to yoga maybe a couple times a week if they're lucky. And so their hips are really locked up. And so then they need pigeon pose, like they need hip work, but then they're not being given enough poses to help them ease into it properly. And so, yes, they're often bringing that leg forward because they want to be more advanced. They want to do the best job. They want to be in the best version of the pose, right? And they're bringing that leg forward, 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 and then they're coming down. And I do think because the pelvis is locked, that they're compromising in the knee. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So
And
then,
okay.
So then in more of a class setting, like a sleeping swan would be a lot more gentle for most people, right?
Yeah, and I want to be clear. I do practice pigeon pose, but I feel that it just requires a lot of work to get into it, and I don't think that there's enough time in an hour and 15-minute yoga class to properly bring people into that pose and then out of it and do everything else that we're trying to do in the class as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. No, I love hip openers, and honestly, with my pelvic condition, it's really therapeutic for me. But to go into a pose that elaborate, we have to do, like you saw the list, like it when I am doing like a full therapeutic practice on myself, that would be my peak pose, and it'll probably take me 2 hours to get there, doing all the stuff to release and really unwind everything and then come out of it and then do the core work to restore integrity to the spine. I do think if you're teaching a yin class, then incorporating sleeping swan or swan can be appropriate because in a yin class, you're going to focus on releasing the myofascia. You're going to have time to intelligently, you would probably do Padangustasana series first, laying on the back, lots of strap work to release the external rotators. You would probably get into the adductors and release them. The pace is slower. And then I wouldn't just plunk them into sleeping swan. I would probably have them in deer pose first and then have them bring their foot towards the pelvis, like I was showing earlier, and then have them sweep their leg behind. Because that gives everyone time to say, ooh, when I put my foot near my pelvis, seated this way, my knee starts to hurt. And then I would talk about that. Like if your knee starts to hurt just there, don't swing your leg back behind you because that's going to make it deeper. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. I feel like it's a problem pose, and it's like I've had clients come into me with injuries because they're in this pose and they shouldn't be, and they've had a teacher come up to them and press down on their hips to try to make them go deeper, and then their knee makes this popping noise. And I'm just one therapist in one city, and I can't imagine the number of people that have had injuries because of it. So it is a bit of a a trigger pose for me, because I'm like, we need to do this intelligently. And I actually really love the pose. I just would love to see more teachers making it a peak pose instead of a pose that's just kind of tossed in wherever. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people do it just like recklessly too. Right?
Yeah, recklessly. And it's a king pose. It should be treated like a king. We should just give it some respect is all I'm saying. Yeah. I really appreciate your asking that, Sarah. Thank you. Okay, there's another question here. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so one of you was just asking about my rant that I published on the blog today. So I was talking about moving from a standing forward fold into Tadasana, and how one of the cues that I think we need to stop doing as yoga teachers is cueing people to roll up into a standing position. And that's because when we're in a standing forward fold, there's some strain that's already occurring onto the ligaments. And as we roll up, we're actually compressing the vertebrae. And so we can cause damage in the spine if we do that repeatedly. So what I suggest cueing instead is to have people move from a standing forward fold into an engaged half forward fold. And then you just bend your knees and let your pelvis drop down, and just use that to rise up. So you're actually strengthening your back as you rise up, and you're providing spinal integrity. So hopefully that answers that question for you. Thank you for asking that. And then Jessica, I'm sorry, I'm reading your question and I wasn't sure which pose you were asking about. You're welcome. You're saying, I'd love to learn more about the preparatory poses for bridge pose. Okay. So Jess is just asking about bridge pose. So Jess, I'm assuming you're just asking about Setu Bandhasana. So I'll just... I think you can see me. So just coming into bridge pose, so where we're lifting up through the hips. Yes? Okay. This is the most hilarious game of charades. I've really enjoyed this class. It's very active for me anyway. So for preparing for bridge pose, that would fall into your back bend family. And it's essentially the same orientation as camel pose and bow pose, except you've inverted yourself. So you're moving into gravity as opposed to away from gravity as far as the front body is concerned. And preparing for that posture could utilize a combination of bolstering. So we could do the pose in a more gentle way with blocks underneath the sacrum. We can also do a lot of prep work to release the spine using horizontal bolsters to free things up. Wonderful. Okay. And then you would want to focus on releasing the quadriceps. So that one would actually be less complex of a pose. As far as I'm concerned, I actually use that one to return spinal integrity. Okay. Wonderful. So for those of you that were able to come to class tonight, you do not have homework. For those of you that missed class tonight, I basically want you to take this pose, Ekapada Rajakapotasana, and I'd love for you to make me a list of postures for each of the categories. So what are the poses? And for those of you that did a class tonight, if you want to do this assignment, it is a good assignment, so please by all means do it. but go through it and make a list of 3 most foundational poses that you can think of that release the adductors. Think of some things that would get into the external rotators, the psoas and the quadriceps, releasing the spine, the abdominals, and I'll say just think about the lower body for now, okay? So that's all I wanted to touch on for class this evening. Does anyone have anything else to touch on before we close? Okay, have a wonderful night. Thank you all so much for joining in. I really appreciate it. Have a good night.